Got my Charlie Brown Halloween mug here. So, well, very good. Well, it's about that time, so we'll go ahead and dive in. Let's see. Yeah, yeah. So we're getting into the next part of the Torah now. We're getting into the book of Exodus, and part of what's interesting about Exodus and then Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy is that we're starting to get heavily into the law portion of the law. Remember, all the first 5 books are called Torah, the law, but we start getting law actually dropped in Exodus, and we get more law in Leviticus. In fact, Leviticus is almost all law, with a couple of narrative exceptions. Numbers will have some law and some narration about the people of Israel wandering in the wilderness. And Deuteronomy will be a recapping of the law on the eve of going into the promised land. So we're getting into that section of the Bible where folks often have problems. They will sometimes start at the very beginning and try to read through all of Scripture, and then kind of hit the wall. You're doing great with Jacob, and you're doing great with the story of Joseph, and it's all exciting. And you're doing good with the story of Moses. And then they start dropping in instructions about how to build a tabernacle. They start dropping in instructions about what's clean and unclean. And so when we get to this part of Scripture, it's often a part that's tough. So part of my upfront warning here, upfront encouragement is stick with it. We are going to be spending several weeks in the law part of the law part of the Torah. And so that's going to be hitting a little bit this week, but much more next week and the couple weeks after. So stick with it. We'll get through this, and the entire rest of the Old Testament is not like this. But it also it's very much reminiscent to me as if you're reading a history of the founding of the United States, and then they say they wrote the Declaration of Independence, then they just drop the Declaration in. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary, there it is. And then a few years later, they're having a constitutional convention. And then they just drop in, we the people of the United States, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. So it kind of breaks up the narrative flow of things. And as I said, folks can sometimes find that difficult, but let's stick with it. So any thoughts or comments before I dive in a couple different ways here? Bob, sure.
Of course.
Of course.
So it's just a small passage, and I read it in the textbook, and I read it in Exodus. I'm really disturbed by that. One morning God woke up and decided to kill Moses part.
Okay,
that's just disturbing.
That circumcision story. That's a disturbing little few verses. Yeah, we'll make sure to talk on that, because that is a little weird interlude there. Yep, no doubt about that.
Thanks for bringing that up, Bob.
Yeah, that's a difficult piece of this. Fortunately, it is just a small piece, but it's still there as part of the canon, as part of Scripture. So, other thoughts or questions before we dive in a little more detail? Yeah, Abby.
I was interested to understand that the parting of the Red Sea was not so much the Red Sea, but the Reed Sea, and looking at it on the map that's in our textbook, going, okay, I didn't know any of this. So that was an aha moment.
Very good, and we will talk about that a little bit too. That's good. Thank you. Well, Steve looks like a James Bond villain there with the cat around his shoulders. Look at that. Okay. At least you're not holding the cat and petting it like Blofeld does. I'm sorry. I digress. But, all right. Well, I'm going to pop the PowerPoint up here. At least that's my plan. That's the Bible. There's PowerPoint. All right. So before we dive into this part of Exodus 1 through 15, I do want to say just a couple things about questions of historicity. This is something that sometimes bothers folks. There was a trend in scholarship back in the earlier part of the last century, mid part of the last century, 1940s, 1950s. And there were biblical scholars who kind of wrote off the pendulum kind of swung too far. You know, if you ask somebody 200 years ago, everything in the Old Testament happened just as is written. It's pure history. And the pendulum swung probably too far the other way. And folks would say, well, you know, Abraham, that's probably really a story. Moses, that's probably a story. Even David and Solomon, that's probably never based on historical characters. That's probably all just pure parable or story or whatever you might consider it. Well, since then, we've dug up stuff from Solomon, and we've dug up a little bit from King David's time. And so, you know, the pendulum has shifted back a little bit. And Moses is one of those interesting buckle characters. It's hard to prove Abraham historically. He's leading a tribe wandering, you know, around. Their nomadic shepherds. They don't leave much of a historical footprint. So it's hard to say, you know, this is the history of Abraham outside the Old Testament. It's easier to say this is Solomon existed outside the Old Testament. We have some evidence for that. We have some evidence for David outside the Old Testament. But then we've got Moses. Where most scholars are, now there's a whole spectrum of scholars, and you'll find some scholars that say Moses completely made up stories. You'll find some scholars that say, as it's written in the Bible, it's exactly right, 112%, exactly right as history. But most scholars in between probably will land on something like this. I've seen comparisons, I think it's a good comparison, of the figure of Moses to the figure, that's a statue of King Arthur. That's a statue of King Arthur at Tintagel Castle, where Arthur's legends have a heavy piece about his existence. And I love this statue. There was a later medieval castle built right next to this spot, but they've been digging and they found old Dark Age remnants of high-end, high-class, castle is too strong a word, but there were some people living in the Dark Ages there that were of the kind of nobility sect. And so there may be some archaeological suggestions that there may be some parallels to King Arthur. Most historians will say there was an Arthur in Britain. He was some kind of warlord or leader. We don't know a lot about the details of him historically. It's probably not exactly like the Arthurian legends that have later talked about. It's probably not quite like that, but there probably is a very historical core. Arthur was probably a real person. And most New Testament scholars these days will probably apply that same kind of reasoning to Moses. Yes, undoubtedly, you know, things have been passed down. We might not have pure history here. We may have had some other parables and stories added later to the narrative, but at some point there is a hard historical core to Moses. Most Old Testament scholars would say. Now there's some that are on the further end of the spectrum, both directions, but I kind of like that. I love this statue of Arthur because you can see him at points, but he's kind of see-through at points as well. Okay, there's a foot, but you know, part of his body is missing there. It's a brilliant statue, but just wanted to kind of start with that. One thing though that's often discussed, and this has been something that's not new, they think that most scholars think there's some kind of link here. There's a verse of our chapters today, Exodus 1:8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And in looking at the history of Egypt, we don't know who these kings, who these pharaohs are. The Bible never tells us that the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus was Pharaoh X. His father was Pharaoh Y. We never get those details. They just talk about the king or Pharaoh. We never get proper names. But there's an intriguing part of Egyptian history that may tie into this verse here. There was a group called the Hyksos that ruled Egypt for about 108 years. And they were not Egyptian. They came down from the area of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Canaan, the Levant. They were Semitic peoples. They were not Egyptian. But yet they came down and they conquered Egypt and they ruled as pharaohs for about 108 years in Egypt. And then they were kicked out by the more native Egyptians. And one of the intriguing thoughts, and it could very well be the case, is that when there was that dynastic change, maybe the new Egyptian king wasn't too fond of Joseph. There's also that intriguing question, we did not talk about this in Genesis last week. Why the heck would Pharaoh make this slave from Palestine, this slave from the Levant, this slave from Canaan, why would he make him number 2 in the country? Well, if the Pharaoh at that time happened to be part of this Hyksos dynasty and came from that same area, ethnically himself, maybe he'd be more likely to. So that's often tied together as a thought. And so maybe when that dynasty ended, there arose a new king who did not know Joseph. And so maybe we have an overlap here. The other thing I would say is that there are all kinds of questions and theories about who the Exodus Pharaoh is. Most folks land on Ramses II. There are several, especially more fundamentalistic scholars, that have an earlier Pharaoh. But most scholars land on Ramses II as the Pharaoh during the Exodus. Yul Brynner in the movie is Ramses II. And if that's the case, then his father, Seti I, would have been the Pharaoh at the beginning of Exodus that tries to throw the babies in the Nile and kill the baby Hebrew boys. And that's also the way that Cecil B. DeMille does it. So Cecil B. DeMille may get a few things wrong in that movie, but occasionally he gets some things that may be right too. And this is probably something that most scholars would say that if we're talking about historical Pharaoh, this is probably the Pharaoh's dynasty that we are talking about. So Ramses II, somewhere in the 1200s for this. Well, let's kind of bracket that off because it's hard to say much more historically. There are we'll say some things as we go, but let's bracket that off. Any questions before I continue though? I can't see everybody's faces on this view, so holler out if you need to. Okay. All right. So with Exodus, we begin the Moses epic. The Moses epic covers 4 books of the Bible: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. 80% of the Torah is from Moses's birth and the events right before it through Moses's death. And so he is a huge chunk of the Old Testament. In fact, Moses is the biggest chunk of the Old Testament devoted to a guy and a time period and an era. He just dwarfs everybody else. This really is, for whatever reason, as far as the Jewish people are concerned, this is the core story. By word count alone, by chapter count alone, they didn't have chapters back then, but by volume alone, the Moses story is the most important. And the theology keeps pointing back again and again in the Old Testament to this period. These 4 books make up 16% of the Old Testament, almost a sixth of the Old Testament. King David pales in comparison. King Solomon pales in comparison. The prophets pale in comparison to the volume and the amount of attention given to Moses. So this really is a foundational, important piece. And so the reason the book is spending a fair amount of time and spending time on Leviticus and Numbers, even though Leviticus is difficult with plowing through the law, is because it is so formational, so foundational to the story of the Jewish people. And so we'll be spending quite a bit of time on that. Thoughts or questions? All right, just a quick overview of the 15 chapters we read. Now, today we went through Genesis really quick last time and only was able to do this at the end. Well, actually, I want to get into the text a little bit today, but this is the general outline here. Chapter 1, you have the story of the Hebrews being enslaved, the new king arising in Egypt, and the Hebrew people being enslaved. Chapter 2 covers the early life of Moses, from his birth all the way to the adult Moses killing a guy and running off to Midian. This is where Cecil B. DeMille really fluffs things out. It's 1 chapter in Exodus. It's about half of his movie, Cecil B. DeMille's movie, The 10 Commandments. Or I should say his second movie, The 10 Commandments, because he made a silent version too. Trivia, anybody seen the original 10 Commandments, the silent version? Cecil B. DeMille obviously loved the story. If he made it in the 20s and then made it again in the 50s in Technicolor with cast of thousands. The original story is wild though, because he cuts back and forth between a modern 1920s scene and the time of Moses. And they go back and forth all through this movie. It's fun to watch sometime. But basically, the theme of that movie is God gives the commandments, and then in our modern world, people are breaking them, and this group and this family is breaking them in this way. And you go back and forth and see the juxtaposition between those two worlds. So it's a different kind of 10 Commandments than his later Technicolor Moses, played by Charlton Heston, Ramses played by Yul Brynner version. But it's a fascinating movie also. But I digress. So chapters 3 and 4, we have theophany, and that was a word that we use in this book. And I think, was this the first chapter that he used it? If not, just a quick word. We talk about epiphany in the church still. Epiphany, epiphanos, phane is shining, is light shining. Epi means shining out from or shining forth from. Theo is God, theology. So God shining forth, God being made known, God being revealed. So anytime that God appears, the technical term is a theophany. There's an appearance of God. So when he appears in the burning bush to Moses, that's a theophany. So 12-cent word for a 2-cent idea. Well, it's an important idea, but it's a technical term, but it's a good one. Theophany. So God being made known to Moses, and he also calls Moses from the burning bush, and we'll hopefully look at that a little bit. Chapter 5 and 6, Moses and Aaron go back to Egypt, and they appear before Pharaoh. And it looks like there's a second call narrative in chapter 6, and the book talked a little bit about that by a call by a different writer, probably the priestly writer, that kind of parallels some of the things that happen in chapter 3 and 4. Then chapter 7 through 11, we get the first 9 plagues of Egypt. We won't go into those in excruciating detail, but we will touch on them. Then chapter 12 and 13, we have a combination on the night before the Exodus itself. We get the Passover, we get the death of the firstborn, the 10th plague. We get the Exodus the next morning, and we get some law. It's kind of the first drop-in of law into the Torah. You get just a teeny tiny bit with the Noah story, but you really get the first chunk. And there's some rules about observing the Passover. Here's the Passover. And in future generations, this is what you're to do. This is how you're to observe it. Find a lamb. This many people need to eat it. If you don't have enough people, get with another family and bubble together and eat your lamb. So we get that first little chunk of law dropped into the narrative. And then they head out of Egypt, and we have the narrative of the crossing of the water at Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds or Red Sea, and we'll talk a little more about that. And the book had a map. I wanted to, any thoughts about this general narrative of Exodus? I wanted to show a map, then I wanted to get into the text in some detail here. I feel like I'm talking a lot, y'all.
On the Passover thing, it's kind of like if we had the Last Supper or something, and then all of a sudden, and you need to celebrate the Eucharist by having the priest come forward, and the people need to gather, and then you say these prayers. And
that's a good parallel. There's a book that probably dates to New Testament times. It probably overlaps. It's called The Teaching of the Apostles, the Didache, and it has a lot of rules about how to do Eucharist. But if you took that kind of instruction and dropped it right into the gospel narrative, this is how you're to celebrate the Last Supper in the church. That's a great parallel, Jimmy. Thank you for that. Thank you. All right. I pulled this map. These are different theories about the route of the Exodus, and if you look at these, probably the pink one is the one that many scholars go with. But you have a whole spectrum of weird theories and more solid theories about the path out of Egypt. I mean, from down here to crossing a little chunk of the Red Sea itself, there are 2 different paths that suggest that. One of the odder ones is this one that actually they were crossing through part of the Mediterranean. There's kind of some barrier islands here, and then they crossed part of the Mediterranean and got back to some barrier islands. That's an odd one. That's probably not the case. Part of it also depends on where you think Mount Sinai is down in the Sinai Peninsula. And there are a couple that I've seen some odd ones that go way, way further south and cross more of a body of water. But what we're probably talking about, most of them probably have a crossing somewhere in these marshy, swampy lakes that are where the Suez Canal now cuts through. Probably one of the cuts like that. The Sea of Reeds is probably the better translation than Red Sea. The book went into some detail about that, but just wanted to say that there are people with a whole spectrum of opinions. Same thing with where Mount Sinai is. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit next time. There are a whole spectrum of opinions. Is it the traditional Mount Sinai that we call Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa, or is it one of the other mountains in that area, or is it over in Arabia? There are some theories about an Arabian Mount Sinai, but we'll talk about that next time. So a lot of your path out of Egypt depends on where you're going next. Where Mount Sinai is determines what kind of route you're taking between point A and point B. If point B is over here, then the route is different than if point B is somewhere else. All right, thoughts or questions here? I do want to look at the text a little bit. So let's see. There we go. So we had 15 chapters this time, which wasn't nearly as daunting as the 38 chapters we had to go through last time. So I did want to look a little bit at the text here. If you notice, the first chunk of Exodus starts out with kind of a reminder of who came to Egypt with Jacob, who are the tribes, the sons here. And so we get that. And we had 70 people of Jacob's family coming down to Egypt at that point. Joseph is already there. Then that generation died. The Israelites, though, they obeyed God's command in Genesis. They were fruitful and they multiplied. That language from Genesis. They do God's command and they expanded as a people over the years, probably over the centuries. Traditionally in the Bible, it says 430 years. Now, whether that's an approximate number or meant to be 429 years plus one exactly is another matter. But several centuries have elapsed at least. We're talking about here. Then we get that famous verse about the new king arising who didn't know Joseph. So we've got some kind of loss of memory of who Joseph is, perhaps tied to the Hyksos dynasty being overthrown and the Egyptians coming back into power in their own land. And notice what the fear is here. The Pharaoh, and here he's called king. Later he'll be called Pharaoh in Hebrew. But he's called king, and it's an anonymous term, as I said. They never refer to which king it is, which Pharaoh. But he's worried that the Israelites are more numerous, and so he wants them he wants to kind of squash them down a little bit. And he's worried about, in the event of war, two things will happen. Number one, they'll join our enemies and fight against us, and they'll escape from the land. Let me throw the map back up here real quick. So in the end of Genesis, the Hebrew people kind of settled in this area. Well, this is kind of swampy, marshy, and this is desert. And so if you're coming down the main road from Assyria and Babylon and the rest of the Fertile Crescent, you come here first. And so if you've got this group living here and kind of the bulk of your civilization's over here, they might be a threat and they might join enemies. They'll be the first ones the enemies encounter. So that's the fear of the Pharaoh here, that they'll possibly lose the slaves and possibly have to fight against, or possibly lose these Hebrews and possibly have to fight against them. So they put taskmasters over them, forced labor, and they oppressed them, but they still multiplied and spread. And hard service, brick and mortar, all that, every kind of field labor, and they were ruthless. Now, we do need to bracket this off. Oh, Bob's got his hand up. Yes, Bob.
So I'll lower it now. So if the new king that knew not Joseph did not have them enslaved before that, is what it sounds like, why care about if they leave?
That's a good.
I know that's nobody knows the answer, but
one of the things I'm going to say something about that too. What this enslavement is, the way, and the pyramids are 1,000 years old by this point. So the Hebrews were not building the pyramids. They were of ancient construction. But the way those things were built in Egypt, it looks like, is there was an off season when you weren't planting, and you were expected to do some work for the government. You were drafted into service to do some building, for a month or two out of the year. And it looks like that's what we're talking about here too, that this enslavement is not, we have such a picture of slavery being the antebellum South and living on the plantation and, awful slave quarters out back while the big manor house is, 200 yards away or whatever. That's probably not what we're dealing with, but we're probably talking with, they are given extra tasks even above and beyond what normal Egyptian citizens would be asked to do. So this group, the Pharaoh's probably squeezing them hard. It doesn't mean they're living on a plantation. It doesn't mean they're, in concentration camps or anything. They're probably living in their houses, but they're assigned these extra tasks kind of over and above what a normal Egyptian would probably have to do. And so that's probably the kind of slavery we're looking at here. Probably what the Pharaoh is worried about is losing some work. So let's really squeeze them. If we're worried about them running off and losing them as a labor force, let's really, they're ethnically different. We can really squeeze them for some extra work, and we can get it out of them. So that's what's happening, but it's still not enough. And so the king of Egypt starts some genocide. I went too far there. He comes to the Hebrew midwives, and notice the wonderful irony. We talk about this being a patriarchal culture and a sexist era, and it is. And yet, the wonderful, delicious irony here, and feminist scholars have pointed this out, and kind of rediscovered this. This was not talked about a lot. King of Egypt, nameless. We got two obscure Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. They are here in our Bible down to this day. These should be anonymous women have their name. And the king, who is famous, the most famous person in the world, maybe the most powerful person in the world at that time, the king of Egypt, is nameless, just mentioned by title. So delicious irony here. And he says to the Hebrew women, take out the boys on the birth stool and you let the girls live. But the midwives don't do it. The king summoned them and said, why aren't you killing the boys? And they make an excuse. Well, the Hebrew women are too strong. The babies just come right out, and it's too late for us to intervene because the Hebrew women give birth so fast. And so we're told that God dealt well with them and rewarded them and gave them families. And so Pharaoh, thwarted by these women, and the Pharaohs are going to be thwarted by other women too. These are the first of 5 women that are going to thwart Pharaoh, or the Pharaohs. Being thwarted there, he commands his people, all right, start chunking them in the Nile, but letting the girls live. Throw away the boys, drown them, but let the girls live. So then we get this mention of the house of Levi, and later we get names of this man, this woman, Amram and Jochebed, or Jochebel in the Ten Commandments movie, but Amram and Jochebed. So these 2 Levites, the Levites will later be the family from which the priests come, the tribe of the priests. Not yet, but this tribe, they have a baby, conceived, bear a son. He's a fine baby. She kept him hidden for 3 months, but then she couldn't keep him hidden any longer. Is he getting too loud? Good question why. But she gets papyrus together. She makes a basket, and the word for basket is exactly the same as the word for ark in the Noah story. So she makes an ark, and she covers it with bitumen and pitch to make it waterproof. Same things Noah used in waterproofing the ark back in Genesis 6. And so she puts the baby into a mini ark. So just as God saved people and animals in the ark, Moses is being saved in a little mini ark as well. She puts him on the bank of a river, and his sister watches what's going to happen. And so we've got mama, we've got sister, and we've got the daughter of Pharaoh, 3 more women who are going to subvert the will and the decree of Pharaoh. And she discovers the baby in the reeds. She sends her girls in to open it, her maids. When she opens it, there's a child. She takes pity on him. And she knows, it says right here, there's a Hebrew baby. She's not unaware of who this kid might be. Hebrew baby right off the bat. And Miriam, we later learn the sister's name out of other stories. Miriam says, hey, excuse me, ma'am. You're going to need to nurse this child. Should I get some woman that's still lactating amongst the Hebrews to do it? And Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, thank you, little girl. And the little girl goes and calls Moses' mother, her mother, Miriam's mother too. And so by a wonderful, wonderful rotation, Moses is given away. Moses is sent away for his safety, and yet his mother gets to nurse him again until it's time to wean him. And then she brings him to Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter takes him as a son and names him Moises because she drew him out of the water. There are a lot of Egyptian names that have some kind of version of Moses or Meses in it. Moses, Ramesses, Tutmosis. So it is an Egyptian name. It also has a Hebrew meaning. I forget what that Hebrew meaning is. Got my Bible in my lap here. But it's a wonderful play on words because it's kind of Egyptian sounding, and it's also kind of Hebrew as well. Can't find my note here. Oh, I think it says that it's begotten. Moses means begotten in Hebrew. Don't quote me on that, but as well as I can read my chicken scratching in my Bible notes there, that's what it looks like. So, wonderful story of the saving of Moses. Later on, the Gospel of Matthew will have a similar story of a baby that's saved from an evil king trying to kill baby boys. And he will later escape to Egypt, Jesus. We'll get to recapitulate all this in the Gospel of Matthew. But then we get a real jump. He's taken to Pharaoh's house as a baby, and then one day Moses is grown up. He sees his people, sees their forced labor. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinfolks. So he somehow knows that he's Hebrew, as well as being brought up in Pharaoh's house. And so he looks both ways, and seeing no one else, he kills the Egyptian, buries his body in the sand. Thinks he gets away with it. Next day he goes out, sees two Hebrews fighting, and he tries to say, hey, don't strike your fellow Hebrew. And they said, oh, why are you ruler over us? You're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian. And Moses said, oops, thought I had it hidden. I didn't. And so Moses was afraid. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he was ready to take Moses out. And so Moses fled and went to the land of Midian. So this, as I said in the movie, The Ten Commandments, is about 2 hours of narrative here. All those subplots of Moses and the Egyptian princess that he's in love with, and the rivalry with Ramses, his brother. None of that's mentioned in these texts. Now there are some later Hebrew stories, Jewish stories that will narrate some of this, and Cecil B. DeMille was drawing on those later things, but they're not here in the Bible. It's pretty quick.
Jim?
Yes.
How would they distinguish a Hebrew from an Egyptian?
That's a good question. If circumcision is happening, which it looks like it's supposed to with Abraham, if the Jewish people were doing that, there is that piece. If you look at Egyptian art, they do portray Semitic peoples from Canaan differently. They have little beards and things, little mustaches. They are portrayed differently in Egyptian art. So there are apparently some ethnic markers that are different. So circumcision perhaps, and perhaps some other tribal ethnic markers as well, the way they look or dress. Good question. All right, so Moses is in Midian, finds 7 daughters, marries into this family, drives away the enemy's dramatic scene with Cecil B. DeMille, marries into this family, and you kind of get the sense that Moses is ready to set down roots in Midian for the rest of his life. And later on, the text will say he spent 40 years in Midian. He was 40 when he left, 40 when he was 40 years in Midian, and then 40 years back for the Exodus. Now that makes him 120. Are those symbolic numbers? Probably. But he spends a long while in Midian. He really has left Egypt. There are all kinds of other possibilities. What was the relationship between Moses and the Pharaoh and the household? There's actually a Turner TNT version of Moses starring Ben Kingsley, the guy that played Gandhi, that was made for TV in the 90s, that I think is much more realistic than Cecil B. DeMille. The Egyptian palaces are nice, but they're not near as golden and fancy. And Moses, the relationship between Moses and the Egyptian rulers is pretty strained. They know he's a Hebrew kid that sis has brought up or daughter has brought up in the house. And so it's not the warm, in the Cecil B. DeMille movie, he's the favorite of Seti the Pharaoh, and maybe not. All right.
And a stutterer.
Go ahead.
And a stutterer on top of that.
And he stutters on top of that in that movie, which he later claims is also the case of Burning Bush here, which is also a good possibility. All right, so if you haven't seen the TNT version, it's I would recommend it. It's interesting. It's so you gotta be ready for that, but made in the 90s. All right, so yes.
I'm really embarrassed to say this, but I will. I have a hard time reading this without hearing all or seeing in my mind that the 10 Commandments, and I feel like that because I've watched it so many times that the Bible's left out stuff.
Right, right.
That it's not the other way around, that Cecil B. DeMille didn't add stuff, but that the Bible left out stuff.
That is hard, especially when you have a husband that asks you to watch it every blasted year. I mean, during around Easter time. I mean, that's just, it does get ingrained, and that's one of the problems with art. I mean, what's your picture of Julius Caesar? Well, the Shakespeare play sure influences that a heck of a lot, and a figure like Macbeth is practically lost our historical sense. He is historical, but we know him from Shakespeare, and so same kind of issue here. Well, in Midian, we do have the great theophany. I wish I could go into it in great detail, but God speaks to Moses out of a burning bush. And don't miss this, the bush is on fire and yet it's not burning up. God's fire does not need fuel. God is self-sufficient. God can blaze without needing wood to blaze. That's a heavy message here. Moses goes and looks at this site, and God calls to him out of this bush, out of this fire that doesn't need fuel to burn. He says, Moses says, here I am. Come no closer. It's holy ground. Take off your shoes. And then the formula, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And Moses hides his face and is terrified to look at God. And then we have the wonderful, yes, Bob.
So I found it interesting scooting up there to the actual burning bush. It starts out, an angel appears in the bush. I hate to trivialize it, but it reminds me of when I ask my assistant, will you please call Joe Blow? And when you get him on the phone, I'll pick up. It's kind of, the angel kind of lights the holy fire, and then God comes in when Moses pays. He's not going to wait around for Moses. That's the angel's job.
That's actually a fun analogy. One of the interesting things about the Old Testament is they aren't really clear whether it's God's angel or God talking. A lot of these theophanies, a lot of these manifestations, is it God the whole time? Is it the angel speaking on God's behalf? And plus we have the layering that's put together, and so you might have some complications there. But that's hold for God, please, Moses. That's a great thought. Well, God does say, one of the questions is, does God care about his people? He's left them in slavery for 400 years, hasn't done squat for them, basically. And two statements here: I've observed the misery of my people, I've heard their cry, I know their suffering, and I've come down to deliver them. Yay, God. Moses must be thinking, you go, God. And then God says, okay, so to deliver them, I'm going to send you, Moses, to Pharaoh to bring my people out. Excuse me? So you get that kind of wonderful dynamic. You go, God, until I'm the one, Moses, that has to do it. And then Moses offers up a series of excuses. We won't go into them in detail. And God keeps coming up with a reason that countervenes the excuses. Over and over, we get this dialogue back and forth. I'm slow of tongue. I don't know what your name is. Well, my name is I am who I am. Yahweh. Tell him I am has sent me to you. By the way, I am is a complicated, Yahweh is a complicated name. It can mean I am who I am, or I'll be who I'll be, or I'll be whoever I want to be, or I am being. I am the ground of being. Or I am whoever I choose to be. Thank you very much, and shut up, for it's not your business who I am to ask my name, because I am who I am. And so all those things are possibilities, and maybe all those things are combined in this interesting, enigmatic name of God. He doesn't get named Bob or John or Jimmy. It's very enigmatic. I am being, or I am who I already am. Wow. Okay.
Isn't Yahweh He is?
And Yahweh, makes it He is. So yeah, you change it into third person. So go. Don't go empty-handed. I need some signs. Well, here's a sign. Your snake will turn into a stick, or a stick will turn into a snake. Your hand can turn leprous. We'll do a trick with that. And Moses will later use those with Pharaoh. And I can't speak very well. Okay, well, Aaron will speak for you. But by the way, who made mouths? Shut up. Your questions are starting. You almost get God getting fed up at this point. And so Moses goes. And then, as Bob asked about, we get this little weird 3-verse story. It's probably something that was better known, that just kind of got dropped in here almost by title. But God has just sent Moses, and then he tries to kill Moses. And Moses' wife circumcises Moses' son and touches Moses' feet, and the book said feet is often a euphemism for genitals, touches Moses' feet with that foreskin, and whether Moses was circumcised already or not is kind of enigmatic. There's question about that. But that's a tough piece. Some of the fundamentalists say, well, even though God wants Moses to serve him, Moses still has to obey the law and be circumcised, and this is a remnant of that. I would think, God would say, hey, by the way, at the burning bush, don't forget to get circumcised before you head out. So I would think there'd be a more clear way for God to communicate that. But this is a very enigmatic, very troubling little passage here. Go on my behalf. By the way, I'm going to take you out because you're not circumcised. Yeah, John, are you trying to?
Yeah. The troubling part might be if he was God, why didn't he succeed?
Yes, I mean, and we could also ask that question with Jacob wrestling with an angel or God. If why doesn't God overpower him at that point? Couldn't God pin Jacob? Well, of course he could, but he lets Jacob. He uses just enough force to resist Jacob. Anyway, that's a good question too. But we do have Moses getting to Pharaoh. He says, "Let my people go." One of the things you may have noticed if you read through this, it's kind of a bait and switch. Let my people go in order to worship me in the wilderness, then they'll come back. It's not till the end that it's let my people go and we're really going to go. There's kind of a dialogue here. And okay, you can go worship in the wilderness, but just your guys. No, we need to take our women and children. Okay, take your women and children, but leave your animals behind. Well, we need to take animals to sacrifice. We'll take some animals to sacrifice, leave the rest. Well, we don't know what animals. And so we go back and forth with Moses and Pharaoh. We also have the very difficult theme, which I won't have time to go into, of Pharaoh's heart being hardened. I don't think God is trying to force Pharaoh into doing anything Pharaoh would not choose to do, but we do have that difficulty in this text too, and that is a real difficulty. Why is God, Pharaoh seems to be willing to let the folks go, and then he changes his mind. Would Pharaoh have changed his mind anyway? I would say probably yes, and most of the rabbis and church fathers would say yes, but that's a difficulty in this text. There's no doubt. We get these signs. Part of also what's going on here is Pharaoh says, hey, I don't know your God. Why should I let his people go? Part of the theme of Exodus is you shall know. God says, I'm going to do these things so that you shall know who I am. Pharaoh's going to know who I am. My people are going to know who I am by the end of this story. You may not know me now, but you'll know me later. I am who I am. Yes, Becky.
Maybe a bit off topic, but when did the concept or idea of free will, that God gives people free will, when did that become a part of this story? Or it's apparently not at this point.
Yeah, I don't think it's so. Moses has the free will to say no to God. Abraham has the free will to argue with God. Jacob has the free will to wrestle with God. But it's not really the theological ramifications of God giving us free will in his creation. That's something that will be much, much, much later. So there is some inherent free will here in some ways, but it's not something that's important at this point. All right, so we get these. Yes, Jimmy, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, and also part of this is the basically God coming to save his people is basically he has to go toe to toe and fight the deities of Egypt too, and the plagues and everything.
That's another thing. We think of God as God of the universe, creator of everything, and I would say certainly he is. In this worldview, your God is only God over a limited territory and has limited jurisdiction over your family and your people and nobody else. Part of this story is that the Egyptian gods are going toe-to-toe with God, and even their priests can do some of the tricks. They can also turn sticks into snakes. They can also make water into blood. Yet they can't do all the things that God does. God outpaces the Egyptian gods. God outpaces the Egyptian priests, and so that's part of this too. In fact, some scholars have tried to say that compare each of the 10 plagues to one of the gods of Egypt. I think that's probably a little overreach, but you can certainly, they certainly had a god of death and life, and at the end, God, by taking out the firstborn, which is a terrible, terrible price to pay, a terrible miracle, God does show that he's stronger even than the Egyptians. And the Egyptians value that God of life. And they embalm themselves and mummify themselves to enjoy life everlasting. And yet they're not, their gods are powerless ultimately over the God of Moses, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'd love to go into these miracles. There are wonderful theories about, these are the natural causes, and there are all kinds of fascinating theories. And maybe there is some natural cause behind it, but then you have to ask, why did it happen then? If it is naturally based, there's still the question of timing. Why did it happen at this point? And so I think we're supposed to see this as God intervening, maybe through natural processes, but intervening nonetheless, and fighting toe-to-toe on behalf of his people with the Egyptian gods. And far more than I can go into, but eventually at the end, we do have the Passover. We do have that first meal. That'll be chapter 12. I should have just skipped down. And God passes over the Hebrew people, but slays the firstborn of all the Egyptians and all their animals. And it's a great cry. And that's finally what makes the Egyptians get rid of the people. And we have rules about how to observe the Passover. We'll skip over that. We have God striking down. And at that point, that's enough for Pharaoh. Pharaoh got up. Egypt is in a loud cry. There's not a house without somebody dead. And he says, get out. And so he sends them out, and they head off across the desert. Again, Pharaoh changes his mind, and he pursues them. But then his army is defeated at the Reed Sea. The text is pretty strong. The Pharaoh and all his army are wiped out. Historically, there's no evidence of that. But, if you're going through a marshy area and there are strong winds, and if the water is pushed back by the winds, which is part of the description, it also says there's walls of water, like Cecil B. DeMille portrays it. But are the walls, 500 feet high, or are they 3 feet high, or 5 feet high, or 12 feet high? It doesn't say how high these walls of water are. The great cartoon, Prince of Egypt, which is beautiful cartoon, Steven Spielberg. There's a lightning flash as they're crossing through the Red Sea, and you can see a backlit blue whale swimming right next to the people as they're walking. It doesn't say anywhere that the walls of water are, hundreds, thousands of feet high. We don't know where they crossed. But it is supposed to be, the Jewish people very definitely see it as a miracle and as deliverance. You also have the question, if a people can get through on foot, but can chariots get through mud? And if the wind shift, the water comes back. All those things are possibly part of the explanation here. But the ultimate theological explanation is God fights on behalf of his people, and the Egyptians don't pursue them anymore after that. That's it for Egypt. From that point forward, they're through, they're out, they are created, they're almost baptized. Later the church will use that imagery that just as the people are brought through the water, we are brought through the water of baptism into a new promised land. And the people will cross water again, crossing the Jordan. It'll get backed up on one side for them to cross over after Moses dies in the book of Joshua. So, and the other thing too, the book also mentioned this in the first creation story, is chaos being pushed back, and it's the water is being held back of chaos that allows creation to happen. And there's almost a sense of new creation with the Israelite people here. And so they do get out of Egypt here. There's tons more I could talk about, but time is slipping away from us. So we'll stop there. No, we won't stop there. One last thing. At the end, there's a hymn of Moses and the Israelites. I'll sing a song to the Lord. But then at the very end of that, it says Miriam also took up a tambourine, and she's called a prophet, which is an amazing thing. That Moses' sister, the term prophet is used for her. Don't miss that. She's going to be an important player. Moses and Aaron and Miriam are all important players in the wandering in the wilderness. And it says she and her ladies, the women, sing to the Lord, for he's triumphed gloriously, the horseman rider thrown into the sea. Many scholars think this is the original text, and that the pieces above it were an expansion of that text by later generations. That it really was Miriam who sang the song, and then later it's attributed to Moses and all of the people, where it really is Miriam and the women. But that's another thing. just another place of the women's place is important in this story, much more than it is in the culture at large. All right, thoughts or questions? We had to go pretty fast through all that, and of course, there's much more we could say about much of that. Stop sharing here and get back to all y'all there.
If there's no other comments at this point, Joseph's taken back at this point, isn't he, or is that a later? Or is that mentioned later?
It is. He is mentioned later. I'd have to look up exactly what route. I can do a word search. But yeah, part of the Exodus, Cecil B. DeMille does get right, is they do take Joseph's mummy with them. Genesis said they would, and they do later bury him in the Promised Land. And so and that's actually one of my favorite parts of Cecil B. DeMille. You got the Levites walking with Joseph's sarcophagus. Jacob loved his son Joseph, chanting this chant about Joseph and many colors was his coat and all that. Anyway, so as Renee says, those movie images get locked in. Yeah, Ann.
When I was in Kosovo, I asked the same question that John asked. How do you tell the different factions apart?
Ooh, interesting.
And what I was told is you can't tell them apart until they open their mouth. And the speech is what tells them apart, different dialects.
Interesting. Now the Egyptians and the Semitic peoples are going to be a little more different ethnically. They're you cannot tell Canaanites from Moabites from they're all Semitic peoples, but there are some differences with Egyptians. Plus Egyptians shave their heads and do some other things Egyptian men do. Well, women I think may have too and worn wigs. I'd have to look that up, but I'm not an Egyptologist. But accent certainly will betray you too. Even in Jesus's time, they talk about the Galilean accent. Your accent betrays you, Peter. You're obviously one of his followers. Your accent betrays you. No, I'm not. Don't even know the guy. And later there's a test later about how you pronounce a word, and they catch people with pronouncing the word wrong. That's fascinating, though. You tell them apart by their speech. Well, y'all, we don't have that problem in America anymore, do we? We don't all talk different in this part of the world, so it's not near as strong as it was the generations before us. I think of Renee's dad, his strong accent. I'll leave you with this. Renee had Jimmy's godmother was from Massachusetts, and she was a geneticist and had a PhD in all this. And Renee took her down to Fort Worth for a baby shower for Jimmy. And Liz, with her strong New England accent, could not understand Renee's dad with his strong Texas accent. And vice versa. Don absolutely could not understand what Liz was saying. And so Renee had to sit there and translate between two Americans, both with pretty strong accents. So funny how those things work sometimes.
Of course.
Yeah, that's great.
Between Benny James and
Thanks,
Simon.
Jim.
Thanks,
All
Jim.
right, we'll stop there, y'all, and we'll pick up next week.
Thank you.
Good job.
Benny James and